Hi, I'm Kathy Hillenbrand. I am a speech-language pathologist who has worked for Western Michigan University for over 30 years. And a primary professional interest of mine is clinical education. So I'm really happy to be providing the 2-hour requirement of professional development in the area of supervision/clinical education that ASHA now requires for individuals who would like to supervise a graduate student or a clinical fellow. So what I'm going to do now is get out of this screen and to get to my slides. I'm almost there. Foundations of Competence in Clinical Education. This is designed to be a starter, an introduction to clinical education. We know that speech-language pathologists can be really good at what they do, but they may not be really good at clinical education or supervision. So ASHA is ensuring that each person who will be supervising a graduate student or a clinical fellow will have a foundation of information upon which to pull. In terms of disclosures, I'm receiving no compensation for this presentation and I have no non-financial relationships. I am a recently retired faculty member in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at Western Michigan University. What we'll talk about today, I want to overview this with you so you have an idea of the range of things we'll be talking about. We'll start talking about the history of ASHA's involvement in supervision/clinical education, and I will tell you that I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably throughout the talk, so be prepared for that. We will talk about the new certification requirement for supervision as well as that of ethics. We will talk about workplace success skills that ASHA believes graduate students need to learn. We also will talk about adult learning, cognitive development, affective development, as well as motivation. These are things that really can influence your style of clinical education and the tools that you'll need to do that well with an individual student. We will talk about strategies for communication with a graduate student or clinical fellow. We're going to spend some time with introspection, talking about your philosophy of teaching adults. We will talk about personal and professional values and ethics. It's really important, I believe, that you understand and can articulate your values and ethics, because that's a really important component of clinical education. And the supervisee needs to know where you're coming from and your perspective on things. The student or the CF will really benefit from hearing your perspective. And as situations come up, which they always do, in professional practice, you will have an opportunity to model your values and ethics for the student. So that's just a really valuable model for the supervisee. We are going to talk about 2 models of supervision, which will give you a framework to visualize, I believe, the entire process of supervision and what the goals are. And we'll also have a model that talks some specifics about how to focus on the questions that you ask and the feedback that you provide. We also will talk about communicating with students throughout the internship experience, strategies for communicating. We will talk briefly about partnering with university programs. By far, the number of supervisory opportunities come through university programs. So I am hopeful that you will want to try supervising a graduate student and get your feet wet with that, because it really is a wonderful way to give back to the professions. We will also have some sources for additional information about clinical education if you are interested and inspired to do that. I do want to talk about my interest in clinical education and how I got here. I was the clinic director at Western for many years, and obviously in that role, I needed to know how to be a clinical educator, but I really hadn't thought much about the scholarly aspects of clinical education. It wasn't until I attended a um, a meeting at Grand Valley State University where I learned about the American Physical Therapy Association's training for clinical educators. In that conference, I immediately signed up for a future clinical training session. There are 2-day trainings offered by the ATPA, and it was a fabulous experience for me. And in that experience, I was further inspired to do more study. I then enrolled in a 9-credit-hour graduate program, a graduate certificate program in interprofessional and interdisciplinary teacher education that was offered through the College of Health and Human Services at Western. And in that program, I studied models of training for clinical supervision across PT, OT, nursing, and speech and language. And frankly, there wasn't much in speech and language, so I'm really happy that we're here talking today. I have done several MSHA workshops over the years on supervision, most recently collaborating with the other university programs in the state of Michigan to talk to the MSHA audience about clinical supervision, hopefully to make knowledge about supervision and awareness of clinical education more prevalent for our members. I am a member of the Council of Academic Programs in Communication Disorders and Sciences, and the only reason I mention this is that it's a great organization when it comes to resources for clinical education. The Council was a leader in providing training videos, great resources for clinical education. And I will say that is a really good resource to go to, as well as ASHA for more resources. ASHA had its first document on clinical supervision back in 1985. It was some years, though, before they put some specifics to that position statement. In 2008, ASHA put together a technical report and the knowledge and skills document for speech-language pathologists providing clinical supervision. Since that time, however, ASHA members have picked up on that foundation of knowledge, which has most recently come to the work of ASHA, and I would say over the past 5 years, 7 to 5 years, where there's been an ad hoc committee working on supervision in speech-language pathology and audiology, which has put together more recent documents and has spurred the new requirement for professional development in supervision. The early motivators of clinical supervision are practitioners, speech-language pathologists who started writing about clinical supervision. Jean Anderson, who is a person whose model we will be talking about later in this talk, first started publishing in the 1980s. Her article was in ASHA magazine, which is now called The Leader, but back in the 1980s, it was called ASHA magazine, talking about training of supervisors, and she published a classic book in 1988. Susan Dowling is another person, an author who you can look for information about supervisory training. Strategies for successful outcomes and productivity. She does great writing that is comprehensive in terms of the history and best practices. And then another fantastic resource is the McCrae and Brasseur book. And McCrae and Brasseur and Anderson come from the University of Indiana in Bloomington, and that is a hub of activity and research in the area of supervision and clinical education. So I would say that particularly Anderson, McCrae, and Brasseur have worked together and created cardinal documents and resources for anybody who's interested in learning more about clinical education. Here we have the new requirements from ASHA. This focuses on what you will see in your ASHA account once you have completed the 2 hours of professional development. So you will see that, actually this is just a snapshot of what came from my account. Documents that I have met the requirements. I have held my CCC for a minimum of 9 months, and I have earned the 2 hours of professional development in clinical instruction or supervision. So that is posted in your account in ASHA, and that's where you can document to your university programs or your CFs that you have met the credential. Now, the other requirement is that beginning with this 2020-2022 certification cycle, you also need to have one CEU, 1 hour it's 0.1 CEU, but 1 hour of professional development in the area of ethics. And I know that MSHA is also providing that education online for its members. I wanted to talk a little bit about the typical graduate coursework for graduate students, and I'm basing this upon the model at Western Michigan University, and not all programs have an on-campus clinic, so I'll talk about that when I get done going through how Western handles clinic. The graduate students who come in the fall semester have coursework as well as on-campus clinic. The graduate students have a couple of therapy clients, and they also are on a diagnostic team. This continues in the spring semester where they have coursework as well as clinic. Their clinic load is bumped up to an additional therapy client, and again, continuing the diagnostic team. In the 2 summer sessions, which are equivalent to 1 semester, the students continue their coursework and their on-campus clinic. And the clinic director who oversees all of the clinical assignments on campus works very hard to make sure that each graduate student, when it comes to the end of that summer session, has had a variety of clinical experiences, including a range of communication disorders that they have worked with, as well as people of a variety of ages. So hopefully by the time the student from Western, who is ready to go into the fall semester and their part-time internship, they have a pretty good understanding of the clinical process. However, these students have not had exposure to every aged client and every communication disorder. So it's through these internships that the knowledge base and the skill level of the graduate students is expected from these internship experiences. The students start with a part-time internship in either the school or medical setting, and then their final semester in the program is a full-time internship in the other setting, either medical or school setting. And again, when the student enters the full-time internship, there are a variety of clinical areas that the graduate student likely has not had exposure to. Hopefully, he or she will have had that academic knowledge base and foundation to support the clinical skills they've been developing, but there will be new learning, and this is what this is what the role of the clinical educator is in an internship setting with a graduate student. Now, for universities that don't have on-campus clinics, you will want to know how much exposure the student has had. So many programs have students go out into the community for little practicum experiences in the first semester, or maybe students are kept on campus and they do simulations or lab work. When you agree to take a graduate student, you will want to know what the clinical experience is of the student that you will be supervising. Back in 2000, ASHA put together a document that identified 9 workplace success skills that graduate students need to learn. I think that 20 years later, they continue to be appropriate for graduate students and clinical fellows. Planning in priority setting will always be a skill area that students need to increase and improve independence in. Organizing and time management is something that particularly needs to be addressed when the students are in a new environment, a new agency, and there are new policies, new rules and regulations that they need to know. Students in 2020 don't have as much need in managing diversity as perhaps they did in the year 2000, because students in 2020 have been raised with computer access to global populations. So I think that although that continues to be a need for students in CFs, probably the need isn't as dire as maybe it would have been in 2000. Team building is important, and we know that this is true as ASHA has required in its standards the need for interprofessional development, interprofessional training, interprofessional service. People work on teams right now. Now, this also has to do with the next point, interpersonal savvy and peer relationships. So not only are we talking about the client-clinician relationship, but the clinical educator and supervisee relationship, as well as that supervisee within the interprofessional team. Organizational agility refers to the student or the CF's ability to understand the organization within which they are working, so that when they have a question, they know who to go to. As well, if they have a conflict, they know who to go to. They know who to talk to. I have found that students in this day and age benefit from knowing very clearly what the ladder is in terms of communication. Who do you report a concern to? If you have a concern with that person, who do you go to next? What is the means of communicating that concern? Those are always valuable things to talk about with your supervisee. Students and CFs always need more work in problem solving, perspective and creativity, and dealing with paradox and learning on the fly. So what happens when the plan that you had in mind didn't work? What are you going to do? You can't just stop and freeze. You need to be prepared with some alternatives. So it takes a lot of clinical exposure for graduate students, particularly, to develop those skills. So throughout all the clinical practice opportunities that they have, especially in the internships and especially in the CF opportunity, students continue to expand their competence in doing that and independence. I like to talk about Bloom's taxonomy because I use it all the time. If we look at the basic knowledge portion, the foundation of this pyramid, we know that student clinicians have the knowledge base that they get from their classes. What is important is, can they transfer that knowledge to other settings, i.e., clinical settings, when there is a client or a patient across the table from them. So the students should be coming to clinical experiences with a knowledge base. They need to then be supported, perhaps, along any of the higher order levels. So they may need help comprehending the knowledge, understanding it, translating it, being able to talk about it, discuss it. The next level of cognitive assimilation of the information is applying it. Does the student know when and how to apply that information to solve problems? Do they know how to experiment? Do they know how to manipulate that information to the event or the session that's in front of us right now? Analysis talks about identifying patterns. So looking at all of the information and understanding it and understanding how it applies to clinical settings, and then saying, oh, I see patterns there. I see this trend with this patient. I think that I want to, make changes based upon that. Cognitive development continues to be more refined in the synthesis level, using old concepts to create new ideas. So that really does require combining information and application and comprehension and knowledge, imagining, maybe modifying and doing some predicting. And then the ultimate level of cognitive development is evaluation. Are you able to compare ideas, evaluate outcomes, do some problem solving, do some rating of how things went? That is ultimately what we're looking for in our graduate students. Now, I will say that a graduate student may be really good and have strong cognitive development, the whole scope handled in one particular area of clinical practice, but maybe not in another. So in this internship, a student may be coming to you, not having much experience and only having knowledge from the coursework for this clinical population. So I offer the cognitive development pyramid from Bloom to you to serve as maybe a visual for you in working through how you might approach a student. Now, there also is an affective development taxonomy where it talks about receiving information, then being open to receiving that information, then being able to respond to it or react or participate in whatever the information is, and then valuing that, so attaching a value or a personal opinion about that information or that activity. Perhaps the person is persuading or explaining to a physician what the lesson, not the lesson plan, but what the goals are for therapy for a particular patient. Another higher level skill is organizing, being able to develop a value system based upon all of the experiences that they've already had. So they're building, contrasting, comparing, putting together, formulating a value, and then internalizing. So being able to take all of these components, the information, the attitudes about it, the ability to communicate about it and discuss it, and adopt a belief system. So that will reflect in the individual's professional practice, their beliefs, their ability to do their work consistently. Hopefully this information will help you think about the supervisee. In social media over the past few years, there's been increasing devotion to and talk about Maslow's motivation model. And when we look at motivation, we look at the base of it as being the physical needs, that in order for us to be fully motivated individuals, we need to have our physical needs met: air, water, food, rest, and health. We all know that graduate students and perhaps clinical fellows may not have a strong base in terms of having their physical needs met. And actually, you may be feeling that now as a professional in this time of COVID pandemic. The next level up from physical needs is security. So in order to have motivation, we need to feel safe. We need to feel stable, sheltered. We also have social needs, the need to belong, the need to feel included, the need to feel loved. We also have the need for our ego development. We have self-esteem. We also have the need for power, recognition, and prestige. When we talk about power, I will just have a little aside here that I think it's important that student clinicians and clinical fellows understand the power of their role as a future speech language pathologist, that their clients and patients may look to them as a source of power that frankly graduate students may not be aware of. So I do think that that's something that might be worth talking about with your supervisee. Ultimately, self-actualization is the top of the model, and where the person sees the need for development and creativity. Now, let's look at what Maslow says. In order for motivation to arise at the next stage, each stage must be satisfied within that individual. So this is a varied perspective, with each individual person responding differently in terms of their motivation. Higher level needs influence future human behavior much more than the lower level needs. So the basic foundations of having the physical needs met, feeling safe, feeling included, really support those higher level needs, which are going to be required in competent, independent professional practice. So some food for thought for you. I also will add information about emotional intelligence, because I think this is a really important area that graduate students and clinical fellows need to be aware of, and some may need improvement in. You will determine that when you have your supervisee. Tipton, who is referenced in the references at the end of this presentation, has a fabulous book on professional practice. Talks about emotional intelligence as the ability to understand your emotions and others' emotions and craft a functional behavior suitable to the context. So in reading this, it also makes me think about those 9 essential workplace skills, that your ability to put your emotions into a little package and figure out how you are going to problem solve that when you are working with others' emotions, whether they are patients, families, your supervisor. It's an important skill to have competence and independence in that. And I would say that there are probably graduate students and CFs who may need some mentoring in that area. Okay, why do we talk about this specifically? University counseling centers are overwhelmed by students who are having difficulties. The Chronicle of Higher Education, a cardinal resource for universities, found almost 90% of universities have seen a rise in anxiety disorders. Nearly 60% have seen an increase in clinical depression. I will tell you that we've seen that at Western Michigan University, and it does rear its head in the clinic. So what could be affecting this? I don't know, but some food for thought. Has social media played a role? In social media, many times individuals are not accountable for what they say. That is very different from professional documentation, where if you didn't write it down, you didn't do it. And that's an old term from back in my ancient times. Social media provides instant reinforcement and acknowledgement, something that in the clinical setting, a graduate student or a CF likely is not going to get. The boundaries are different than what they used to be. This first came to my mind several years ago when, as clinic director, a student who is going to be a new clinician sent me an email, and it started out, "Hey, Kathy." And I had never met this student before. I'm a couple of generations away from this student and was surprised with the lack of formality that this student used. But I think that you might see that. So just to have that on your radar. Now, can this also be affecting students' anxiety? Are there higher expectations? And I think that there probably are. Information is so much more accessible that it's everywhere. There's almost too much information, and it's very difficult to sort out what's important and what isn't. The scope of practice in speech-language pathology and in audiology has expanded too, again, requiring higher expectations of students for their knowledge and skill base. Clinical educators must be aware of the ways that generations are different. Clinical education is a form of teaching that needs to think about that. The education for a particular graduate student or clinical fellow needs to be tailored to the needs of the institution in which you work, the patients or clients, and the student clinician, and your own personal and professional values. So given this, supervisors need to be aware of factors that influence their approach to clinical education. Tipton talks about tension points, primarily between generations, but differences in the value that we may be feeling strongly about. So we have a strong work-life balance value that can interfere with autonomy. The value of having a reward for what you do might create a tension point around entitlement. Self-expression may be an important value for an individual. That could be interpreted as imagination. I see that as a positive. The value of attention, or having the value of attention and attending to things closely, could be interpreted as self-absorption. Achievement, or the need for achievement, and the need or the perhaps feedback given by a supervisor to a student about achievement that maybe was less than what the student thought, you might have defensiveness as a response. Informality really is the opposite of formality, which some people may see as being abrasive. Simplicity, simplicity might be seen as just having a myopic perspective of things. If someone really values multitasking, that may be interpreted in some situations as being unfocused. And if there's a person, an individual who has the value of meaning, intensity of meaning in an activity, that could be seen as the person otherwise being indifferent or not really having the motivation for that. So hopefully you can see how values and behaviors or perspectives can create tension points when you are working as a clinical educator. Some general strategies for educating students in CFs: establishing clear expectations and goals. And I think that particularly in 2020, the providing of very clear expectations in black and white, in writing, as well as discussing them orally, is really important. Providing extensive orientation, so letting students know when they're going to be evaluated, when they're going to get feedback from you, when they will have a meeting with their university liaison, if that will happen, when there are team meetings each week, what the responsibilities are, it's really important to provide that orientation so the student knows. And the CF, providing structure, guidance, and mentoring. And I think that those are probably 3 words that will really help you. So you want to make sure that you're providing a lot of structure. And then you may be able to provide guidance, stepping back a little bit and guiding the student once the student has picked up the structure. And then finally doing mentoring, which I view as stepping back even further. So you aren't really guiding as much as working as a colleague with the student. And it's such fun to see the independence and to go through those levels as a clinical educator. And I can't wait for you to experience that. Providing personal feedback is important, and immediate, fast feedback is appreciated. Students say that they like that. So whether it's a text or an email, or I don't know what other means you might be communicating with your supervisee, but students really appreciate the immediate feedback. And students these days love technology-based learning opportunities. So providing links to resources for them to research before they, or as they're preparing for a therapy session or an evaluation, or using technology in your communication will really be valued by students. There are some general strategies for communicating with students that gives just a little different perspective from the previous slide. Putting information in writing, using outlines and agendas, being very specific, being direct and straightforward, particularly in your feedback. Make students accountable. Be clear enough with the information that you've provided that the students know what they need to do to be accountable. Students like casual conversation. They appreciate knowing why you made the feedback that you did. And then ask the student for feedback, because when we talk about communication styles and learning styles, the adult learning models say that there is variation. So each individual supervisee will likely want feedback in a different way. Now we're going to do some introspection, talking about values and ethics. Values give meaning to our lives. They guide our thoughts, decisions, and actions. And we know as clinical educators, modeling professional practice for students or a CF, that these are going to be viewed and used in daily interactions, put into practice in our daily lives. The learners need to internalize their values, their morals and ethics to make the best decisions for their ethical practice. Learning values and ethics is a lifelong practice, and our graduate students have a course in ethics. The goal of ethical practice is to do the right thing for the right reason. But this gets muddy because there are often many right actions or choices, and the difficulty is selecting the best one for the given situation. It is likely your personal values and ethics that are going to lead you to a particular right action or choice in a given situation. I believe that you need to know thyself. What are the basic values that guide your actions and choices? Are you aware of your values? Because it's really important to professional practice and to clinical education. And just being aware will be important in the clinical education aspect. Knowing our values helps us understand what is important, why we think it's important, what's meaningful to us, why we think it's meaningful, and what ideas are worthy, appropriate, correct. When we're doing clinical education, we may need to explain our values and ethics to the student that we're supervising or the clinical fellow so that we are helping them understand your perspective. I want you now to take 5 minutes. So I'm going to set my timer on my phone here for 5 minutes, and I will let you know when we're at the 2-minute mark, and then 1-minute mark, and then when we need to wrap up. I love to do this in a group setting where we can talk about it with the participants, but obviously we can't do this now. So what I'd like you to do is take 5 minutes to make a list of 10 professional values that you have and 10 personal values that you have. So I'll just throw out a few of mine. Timeliness is important to me. That's a professional value as well as a personal value. Generosity is a personal value of mine. Competence is something that I value. And willingness to learn is a huge personal and professional value for me. So hopefully that will get you started. I'm going to step aside now, and I will be back in touch to let you know how the time is going. I'll see you in 5 minutes. You have 3 minutes left. The time is half up, 2.5 minutes left. Two minutes. You have 1 more minute to talk about or to list 10 professional values and 10 personal values. Fifteen seconds. Okay. I hope that you found this activity helpful in terms of thinking about what's important to you, because these values reflect your professional practice, your daily lives, but also will affect your clinical education. So I hope that you continue to think about this and just keep it in the back of your mind as you have a graduate student clinician or a clinical fellow that you are supervising. So now let's get back to the slides. Hope you're doing well. And I would say that in real life, in person, I love to have individuals talk about their values. I usually have individuals put them on sticky notes and then read them, and there are themes. But it's always really fun to hear each other's values, because many times you say, well, wait, that's a value of mine too, like humility, something like that. So it's always fun to do it in a group. I'm sorry, we can't do that today. As I said, your model will help a student form their understanding of ethics in professional practice, may also stimulate the student's thinking about their own professional and personal values. And obviously, all these will continue to develop with clinical experience. So if you're seeing a graduate student, you may be in some new territory in these areas. A CF likely has a stronger foundation in these areas that you will continue to groom and model. Now, we do have different values. So the professional values are driven by ASHA standards, the philosophy of the institution that you work in, for example, approaches to student training and whether a site takes students, versus personal, where we have cultural and generational influences. I clearly am a baby boomer in the way that I think and my values. The experiences that we have professionally and just our world knowledge, our personal expectations that kind of go with our personality too. Are you all business or interaction based, less formal? It's important that, again, I don't want to drill this in too hard, but you need to know where you stand on this and communicate it to the student. Talk about it early in that orientation time, because there will be events that trigger the need to talk about it more. I love this quote from Van Riper from 1956, because I think that it encapsulates everything. Each of us has his own strengths and weaknesses. Therefore, we would hesitate to insist that all of us should supervise in the same way. We are individual clinical educators who are educating individual student clinicians, graduate students, and individual clinical fellows. Hopefully, in our talk today, you will have some strategies to help shape the way you will do your clinical education. Now, Karen O'Leary at Wayne State University and I put together this graphic of clinical education. And what I'd like to do is just to walk through it. There are all of these things we've actually talked about. before. So we will start with generational differences, especially in the values. Those are factored into the clinical education model. The student's experience level. Is this the first off-campus experience, or is this a graduate student in their final full-time internship, or is it a CF who's already earned the master's degree? The student's emotional intelligence plays a big role in clinical education. We talked about the expectations of the sites where you're working, the procedures and the mandates that are required that just are not negotiable. We think about the student's self-awareness and the clinical educator's self-awareness and assessment of themselves. So here's where we think about the cognitive domain, the affective domain, the motivational level in terms of critical thinking, emotional intelligence, and values all coming together. The clinical educator's personal values and the professional values, of which much will be driven by ASHA's professional standards. And then ultimately the many roles that the clinical educator takes in being not only an educator, but a coach, a guide, a mentor, who is enhancing the knowledge and skills of the supervisee and transforming that individual into a more competent, more independent clinician. Now, essential skills in clinical education. Maintaining an effective working relationship with the supervisee. Modeling and facilitating professional conduct. Sharing the ethical, legal, regulatory reimbursement information for your setting, and it's important to do that early on. Assisting the student clinician or the CF in development of clinical goals and objectives, again, important to do early on. Develop and refine the clinician's skills in assessment and intervention, and this is going to be an ongoing process, depending upon the knowledge base of the student, the experience that the student brings. Demonstrate and participate in clinical service provision. So I would say that in my experience, most internship supervisors have the first week of the internship as observation only. So the student clinician is just watching the way that the clinical educator does their work during the week. It's important that the student be able to observe and analyze their assessment and treatment sessions, get that higher level thinking. The clinical educator will provide oral and written feedback to the clinician, again, responding to the preferences that the student has given. Holding supervisory meetings on a regular schedule. In my experience, supervisors have had brief daily meetings with the students to talk about the plan for the next day or to review what went well, what might you do differently next time. But also there might be an end of the week meeting as well to wrap up and prepare for the next week. Clinical educators are required by university programs to provide formal evaluation of clinical performance, perhaps midterm as well as final, but always final. The clinical educator will support and develop the clinician's communication skills, oral as well as written, so professional report writing. And then support experiences for that student or the CF to get interprofessional collaboration experience, which now is a requirement for certification. Here we are at Jean Anderson's continuum model of supervision. I love this model because it makes really great sense to me and it's visual. I can keep this in my forehead as I think about how supervision is going with a particular student. We look at the role of the supervisee in white and the supervisor with the hash marks across the course of supervision. So starting out it is very strongly reliant on the supervisor modeling and probably demonstrating doing the therapy while the supervisee observes. However, over the course of the internship period or the CF, whatever the situation is, there will be increasing independence and responsibility by the supervisee so that the supervisor doesn't need to be providing as much support across this continuum. Ultimately, you have a consultative relationship between the supervisee and the supervisor who really make decisions as peers. The style of feedback is very directive by the supervisor in the early stages. But as the student clinician or the CF is demonstrating more independence and doesn't need as much reliance on the supervisor is able to step back and perhaps do more guiding rather than saying, I want you to do it this way for tomorrow. And then eventually being to this collaborative, consultative model with the student. In looking at the level of the stages of clinical education for the supervisee, it's very much early on evaluation and feedback geared with the evaluation and feedback provided by the supervisor. Across the transition, though, across the timeline, it will be less specific evaluation information and feedback from the supervisor. And again, probably more guiding and what do you think about trying it this way next time? Or in the past, I've done it this way in the past. What do you think? Do you think that would work with this client in tomorrow's session? So that eventually the individual is able to do some self-supervision, to take that analytical approach, the evaluative approach to looking at service delivery and the level of knowledge and skills that the student has. So I hope that this is meaningful for you. I really have admired this model for a long time. I'm going to show you what we have used at Western Michigan University because it's the rating scale that we ask our clinical educators to use to rate the performance and the competencies of the graduate student clinicians. And I see it as one numerical form for Anderson's continuum model of supervision. When I look at a range of 1 to 5, I always look at a number 3 as kind of being my fulcrum from which the student either exceeds in independence or requires more supervisory independence. So I look at this model as an independence rating. At the 3 level, which is really where I start I would say at a midterm evaluation, I would say, okay, I'm going to look at all these competencies that the student needs to meet for the university or the CF needs to meet for certification. I'm looking to see whether the student and the supervisor are working together with specific guidance from the supervisor. If the student is requiring repeated instruction from the supervisor, there hasn't been much growth in that student's performance, and it is, I would say, emerging or marginal. If the student fails to demonstrate a particular competence, behavior, or skill, regardless of the amount of supervisory input, the student is not responding to the guidance that's being provided. So if we look at Anderson's model, if the supervisor is providing this direct feedback continuously, and over time the student is not assuming the independence or the responsibility in that competency area, something is wrong and the student is not meeting the expectations. So if a student is showing more independence and less reliance on the supervisor, I view that as very good performance, and the student is refining the skill. The 5 level indicates that the student is really operating independently, not that he or she does not need supervision, but that the student is able to make decisions and demonstrate knowledge and skills independently with some guidance on the part of the supervisor. So if we go back to Anderson's model, if we're starting out with somewhere between here being the rating of a 3, where it's kind of 50-50 involvement by the supervisor providing feedback and the student's independence, as we're going in this direction, the supervisor is becoming more of a mentor and a person who guides rather than needs to provide that direct active feedback. You will find that universities will be using a system such as Calypso. It's an online system for documenting the knowledge and skills that students have. It also is used for tracking clinical hours. Calypso is used by some universities. Others may use a system like Typhon. But you will find that you will be required to provide a rating on the student's performance when you do your evaluations for the university program, as well as for the ASHA form for the CF. Okay, the next model that I want to talk about is called the SQF model, Situation, Question, Feedback Model. So this is different from the continuum model in that there are very specific stages of questioning and types of feedback that you are providing based upon the learner, the urgency that the action needs to be taken in a situation, the complexity of the task, and the consequences to the patient or the student. So I'm going to start out talking about the situation and give you some examples, but I do want to talk a little bit more about the SQF model. The SQF model came from the field of athletic training, and there are 2 individuals who have systematized the clinical education that they provide their student athletic trainers. So when they talk about the learner in their situation, the learner is a person who wants to be an athletic trainer. The urgency of the situation for athletic trainers probably is this a broken leg? Is it a sprain? Is there blood? Task complexity has to do with the skill that's required at that time for the physical ailment, and then the consequences to the patient and the student. Now, the questioning that is used by an athletic trainer, the individual questions will be different, but the perspective and the philosophy is the same, as is the feedback. So I hope that you get a taste of that today. Okay, we're talking about the situation. Now, this is kind of academic here, but I want you to just think about it. That when students come in, sometimes they are unconsciously competent or consciously competent, or at the earliest level, unconsciously aware of their competence. So students may be coming to you not knowing in the areas that they need to grow in. They don't know what they don't know. So you need to be providing a lot of information. You may see a student who comes in who has had some clinical experience and knows what to do in a particular task, but requires supervisory guidance to tailor it to that particular setting. So the student is able to modify their plan based upon the supervisory input. Now, what actually was a great situation is when a student is at the level where they're not aware of their competence. And a major role of the clinical educator is to reinforce and validate that that student has skills, but might need a little more fine-tuning. So something to think about when you think about the learner that you have in your situation, whether you are, well, actually, if you are supervising a CF, you probably have a person who has some competence of which they may or may not be aware. However, in a new disorder area or in a new setting, that learner might be down back to that early level of learning so that they don't know what they need to know. So that's a role for the clinical educator to know where the learner is. Now, in terms of urgency of the situation, when we're talking about athletic training, you are seeing that, well, we actually talked about that the urgency might be that the individual is bleeding or that the individual needs some quick action. In speech and language therapy or audiology work, the urgency might be the requirement requirement for the client so that the client gets some feedback quickly. So it might be related to timing rather than actually having an emotional urgency. In terms of task complexity, if a student clinician is preparing for administration of the SELF-5, for example, the clinical evaluation of language function, that is a much more complex task than administering the Goldman-Fristow test of articulation, perhaps for a particular student, or maybe the Peabody picture vocabulary test. So this gets factored into the situation as well. Now, it may also happen that the task complexity requires that the student be on top of the stimuli that they are presenting. So there is urgency to the student's action. There also may be consequences that need to be factored into the situation so that if the student clinician does not accurately administer a test, the consequence is going to be that the data that they achieved may not be valid. Or if they're not administering the test in the environment or in the order that they should have, there are direct consequences to that, and the student may need to redo that task. So that gives you an idea of the levels of the situation for which the S in SQF represents. Now, there are 3 levels of questioning that we will be using. And as we look at the 3 examples here, you will see that the first one is to confirm factual and conceptual knowledge. If you think about Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive development, this is the knowledge stage. We want to make sure that the individual has the correct knowledge. We also may be demonstrating a clinical procedure or a skill, or talking about very actively and directly how we are thinking about a situation. But in terms of thinking about staying close to the student, you're going to have your eyes on the student the whole time to make sure that they have that basic knowledge. Secondly, the next level would be to provide strategic questioning to really encourage the student to do some critical thinking. So if you know that the student has the knowledge and has the skills, but needs maybe a little push to think more broadly, or to look up additional resources, or to have the student make some decisions, that's where you, as a clinical educator, are creating more space from that student. You are stepping back from that direct one-on-one, hand over hand, if you will, questioning. Ultimately, we want to be creating distance, definitely in clinical fellows, but toward the end of an internship with a graduate student, you will want to be providing increasingly varied and challenging opportunities, reducing the frequency of direct supervision, challenging decisions that this clinician has made, asking for rationale, encouraging thinking through multiple options. And this bullet point to me says encouraging independent critical thinking. Now let's go back. Let me check my next slide. Yeah. Let's go back and look at some examples of types of questions you might ask. So for example, if we have the athletic training example for the first bullet point, the style will be confirming conceptual knowledge. The supervisor might say, keep the pressure on the cut for 5 seconds, a little bit longer, and then we'll take a look to see what we need to do next. So you are talking side by side with the supervisee to explain what you're doing and to confirm that the student or the CF is in fact understanding the situation. Let's make that more complex. For the creating space, the supervisor says to the student, you're doing everything right. I'm here if you have any questions. So there, the role of the clinical educator is to reinforce and provide feedback, supportive feedback to the student that they in fact are doing the right thing, but knowing that you are standing by, you're available if needed or if there are any questions. And then the ultimate creation of distance is to provide feedback such as, you have this, let me check this when you're done. I'll be in 5 minutes. Looks like you have no difficulty doing this activity with your client. I need to run out for a minute. I'll check in. Let me know if you have questions. So I think that the level of questions that you ask will help increase the student's independence, not only in knowledge and skills, but in those feelings of competence and being able to take the bull by the horns, so to speak, in the next session and not need as much supervisory input. It can be very motivating. But you need to pay attention to your questions. So I would say in the university clinic at Western, the supervisors in the clinic did pay particular attention to using the SQF model, looking at the types of questions so that they weren't answering every question that the student clinician had, that they were encouraging the student to do more thinking independently. Now, when we talk about feedback, there are 2 types of feedback. One is corrective feedback, and the other, oh, I'm sorry, I'm blanking. Excuse me, just for a minute. I've lost my note. Feedback to confirm or corrective. I forgot the confirming component. So in terms of feedback, confirming feedback is feedback that lets the student know that their knowledge and skills are correctly being applied. So we saw that in the example. You're doing the right thing. I'll be here if you have any questions. What the student is stating, you want to confirm that what the student is stating is accurate and what that they are doing is correct, and you're confirming, also reinforcing and motivating the student. This level is the early level of feedback, confirms the student's basic knowledge skills so that it's very specific. It can be delivered orally, in writing, again, whatever modality seems to be the best for the student. But it is a way to confirm those early levels in the cognitive domain of having the information and analyzing and synthesizing it correctly. Now, the next level of feedback is corrective. This feedback lets the student know when the knowledge or skills are not on target. So you may actually be providing some confirming feedback. Yes, you administered the Goldman-Fristow test of articulation, version 4, perfectly, but we need to talk about the analysis of the results because there were some errors perhaps. Either the skill was applied incorrectly or a concept or the results were not accurate. So you are still targeting the student's basic knowledge and skills, but you are trying to nip any errors in the bud so that next time the student doesn't make an inaccurate analysis or inaccurate operation of an activity. Now, here's the tricky part. Corrective statements need to be provided in a non-confrontational way, and if at all possible, not in front of patients or peers, and that is definitely true. So there are times when in the university clinic, I have come into the session, into the actual therapy room to provide some feedback, but I try to do that in a very social way. So for example, talking to the client, saying it's great to see you. I just wanted to give one little, tidbit to Mary Beth and give my little advice and then quickly duck out and see what happens. Depending upon the situation, you may want to provide your corrective feedback later. And again, it needs to be very specific so the student knows what they need to do to not make that incorrect action again or skill or have that knowledge. Now, the last type of feedback is guiding feedback. And if we think about Anderson's continuum model, we are looking at the levels that are on the far left. I'm sorry, right. We are looking at this level where the student is doing a lot of really accurate things correctly, but there needs to be just a little bit of guiding feedback. I'm just going to stay right on the slide to talk to you about guiding feedback. It's feedback that reinforces and advances the student's skill and knowledge level. So again, you may be pairing that with confirming feedback and corrective feedback, but there probably is some element of the task that the student was doing that does warrant guiding feedback. It targets the student's advanced knowledge and skills and is used to transition the student from relying on those basic skills toward more refinement and advancement, eventually to the point of being a peer, a consultant, a collaborator in clinical practice. Guiding feedback can be provided during an activity and afterwards, and actually publicly or privately if, as appropriate. So again, using the methods of feedback, of communication that the student clinician has preferred. So I love Anderson's model in providing that visual framework for the specific things that we're talking about in SQF. Our ultimate goal is to build critical thinking in student clinicians and clinical fellows. The instructor, the clinical educator, can help students understand that critical thinking is practiced intentionally and requires evaluating the claims of others. So think about the cognitive domain, the affective domain. Students need to be at those levels to be able to think critically. Students need to understand that some reasons are better than others for supporting their clinical knowledge and decisions, especially when engaging in evidence-based practice. And I think this also taps into the ethics of a decision. There may be many right decisions, but the critical thinking should lead an individual to narrow down fewer options for that particular situation or patient. Some ways that clinical educators can develop critical thinking are to basically provide opportunities for students to understand and apply these skills. Obviously, through the questions that the supervisors are asking, the students can be encouraged to think more broadly. I tended to ask graduate student clinicians at the end of the semester what the recommendation was for a client that they had in the clinic that I was supervising. And the student would say, well, I'm recommending continued therapy. Of course, the client needs more therapy. And I said, okay, what happens if the client comes in and says, I can't come to therapy anymore, or I don't want to do therapy anymore? What will your recommendations be then? So that's an example of a type of question that will really give the graduate student an opportunity to show some independence in decision making and analyzing and synthesizing the information that they know and coming up with an alternative so that they know that they can do that they can think broadly about the what ifs. Talk to students about the importance of open-mindedness, awareness of how their attitudes can change, how they are always forming and modifying their beliefs and decision making, and those are important to the individual student's critical thinking. And I apologize for some errors in that particular section of the slide. We have successfully used reflective journals with our students in the university clinic to have them at the end of each day just write a paragraph about how they thought the day went in the clinic, things that they would do differently next time, things that went well, things that they really need to research or look at more resources for. You may need to create experiential opportunities to tease out from the student where there are misunderstandings or a lack of knowledge. You might only know that something went really wrong in an activity, and you might need to really think through and test out where the student's difficulty lies. It might be in one area, it might be across several. And again, as we've said before, providing students feedback through their own assessments of how they did and formative assessments like a midterm formal evaluation where they're rated and an evaluation at the end of the semester. Now, we need to talk about telepractice. Given the COVID pandemic, this is now a very real service delivery method. Telepractice can be a helpful and ethical mode of service delivery for audiologists and speech-language pathologists. And in many settings, clinicians are using only telepractice to deliver services, who typically receive in-person services. Now, according to ASHA, Rather than using the words telehealth or teletherapy, ASHA prefers to use the word telepractice because it encompasses delivery of services in both healthcare and education. I think that telehealth is considered to be more hospital medical based. But as telepractice is being used in schools and has been used in schools at the end of last school year in 2020, as well as in healthcare settings, they also ASHA wants to use the word telepractice. While many state licensure laws and payment policies refer to telehealth, the terms are interchangeable. So what is really crucial is that you understand the requirements of your state licensure board and the insurance companies to which you may be billing about what the policies are for telehealth. Delivering supervision from a distance requires additional knowledge and skills, including the elements of managing technology, complying with licensure and security requirements, especially particularly HIPAA, and providing feedback. How do you provide feedback? And things like this. Now, I want to read this from ASHA. The clinical educator has an ethical responsibility for the welfare of the individual receiving clinical services and must determine if telesupervision is an appropriate means to supervise a particular student clinician. So you may think that in a particular setting, or the client, or the level of independence of the student clinician, that telepractice may not be appropriate for you to be supervising. When implementing telesupervision practice, consider the security of the telesupervision transmission in light of the state and federal laws, including HIPAA and FERPA, policies about safety, liability, whether a certified or a licensed professional needs to be on site or supervising are also important. And that is particularly true when you are seeking reimbursement for services. Now, these are some tips from ASHA about telesupervision, and I'm going to follow these up with some tips from an SLP who's been doing telesupervision. So I would say that you would have your meetings with your student probably via virtual means to provide your orientation. You can have your student observe your work during the first few days of the internship or the clinical fellowship, so the student has a good idea of what is going to be required. ASHA recommends to conduct a trial prior to the scheduled therapy session or observation to make sure that you have the equipment set up, that you know how to operate it. Always have an alternate means for the telesupervisor and clinician to communicate. So it may be texting, it may be some other means. So there's a way for you two to connect in an actual teletherapy, telepractice session. Providing the background case information as well as an outline for the test plan or the lesson plan in advance helps the camera placement so that the telesupervisor can have an optimal view of the student as well as the client and the materials. If online feedback or instructions are being provided during the session, the supervisee can receive the communication through an earpiece if you want, or you can just take notes as you are supervising the session and give the feedback to the student after the session. Okay, here's the nitty-gritty from an SLP who's been doing telesupervision in April, May, June, and July. Regarding the equipment, this supervisor says many people use a headphone or a speaker when they are supervising, if you get the image of the McDonald's setting. It helps you hear more clearly, especially with articulation clients, and it helps your voice to be clear when you are speaking. This SLP says really learn the mechanics of your virtual system, know how to turn the sound and the video on and off, know how to share your screen, know how to give mouse control to someone else so that the client can do the work or a child can draw. And you need to understand how to troubleshoot or take over from the student clinician for a few minutes while the student reboots or something like that if necessary. It's also recommended that you have the students send you lesson plans. So there are links to the tasks that are going to be asks of and the materials so that you can look at those and you have them in the event that the students' technology isn't able to provide the plan or the materials for the client. Another important point is organization. This SLP says always have clients' email addresses and phone numbers handy so you can call them if they're late or you lose a connection or they forgot the session. You also want to have their phone number or the number for emergency services and that person's location if something medical arises. So the comment is, we have a client who frequently doesn't have sound but had visual. So the clinicians talk to her by phone and she sees the materials on her computer screen. Another suggestion, have the feedback template handy. The supervisor says, I load the notes. So this is the written feedback that she's providing, and save them under the student's name and minimize them the notes. So she already has her template all set up. Then I pull up the note of the student I'm actively watching to fill out the sections. At the end of the hour, I quickly complete the notes, save, and get ready for the next sessions. And I don't know how the notes are sent to the student, but I assume via email. This SLP also recommends recording each session. I think that probably is important, especially until you debrief that session with your student clinician or the CF so that you both can talk about strengths and areas of need for the next one. Other points, have the students send you session plans that include the links. Oh, we already talked about that. And remind students to alter the materials for the font size. So she says, you'll never know the size of the screen that your client is working on. Some have smaller iPads, so being able to increase the font size during a session is really important. So make sure that your student clinician or CF has thought of that when they've been preparing their materials. Let's breathe, because now it's time for the big picture. I like to look at the levels of support that a clinical educator provides varies. It might be watering a student clinician who is just beginning clinical experiences or has a range of clinical experiences, but not across the spectrum that is required in this particular internship or CF. So you are providing reinforcement. You're providing a lot of feedback, instructions, information. You may find that you're also providing some trimming so that the student has developed some skills, has a good knowledge base, is blossoming, but maybe there needs to be a little bit of supervisor cutting back or I don't want to say interfering, but supporting growth in a way. So just kind of modifying a little bit the style of supervision that you're providing. There may be times when you do need to do some significant pruning. Maybe these little trimmers aren't going to be sufficient. You might need to have some major pruning, difficult conversations, perhaps or not, with the student or the CF to get back on the right track. Now, you also may be doing some hedge shaping. So you may have a student clinician or a CF who really is strong, who has lots of knowledge and skills, and you see your role as one of just shaping, fine-tuning, refining, providing that kind of information to the clinician. Now, I do want to talk about the partnering with academic programs. Again, as I said, the majority of supervision situations are related to student clinicians and university programs. The primary role of the university liaison, which may be the clinic coordinator, is for that person to carefully, thoughtfully select and arrange internship opportunities for each student. Hopefully, the university liaison has thought carefully to select a good match for your work environment. The university liaison needs to be communicating frequently with clinical educators so you know what the expectations are for the university. You see the forms that you're going to be using to evaluate the student, perhaps at midterm, but definitely at the end of the semester. The university liaison also needs to be a partner with the clinical educator to resolve any signs of difficulty that might come up along the internship or clinical, actually it would be the internship, because the clinical fellowship is not one that involves the university program anymore. The roles of the clinical educator generally are to provide clinical experiences to expand the knowledge and skills of the student, clinician, or clinical fellow. Your job is to provide all of the trimming and pruning to help this individual develop and grow in independence and competence. You also will be looked upon to model professional manner. It's really important that you contact the university liaison whenever a concern arises and as soon as a concern arises. It's really important that we can nip little problems in the bud or have bigger conversations if that is needed, but you do not need to do that alone as a clinical educator. You need to be working along with the university liaison who knows the student, who knows the history of the student, who probably can provide you some resources and alternatives to get through perhaps a difficult situation. Big picture, I today am planting seeds for you, a future clinical educator. And I hope that you are finding that you have rich soil and reinforcement and guidance that will help you grow into being a competent clinical educator. Before we end, I want to talk about a scenario, a case study. This was one that I was involved in and worked closely with the medical setting. So this was a pediatric medical setting. And the clinical educator that had been assigned to the student clinician was a new clinical educator. Colleagues, so more experienced clinical educators, became aware of the student clinician's inappropriate, described as off-putting nonverbal communication. So this behavior was like rolling the eyes and just looking exhausted and not being tolerant of what others were saying. There was a face-to-face meeting with the student, and the university liaison, as well as the more seasoned clinical educator who was overseeing that internship match. The student was surprised by those comments when they were brought to her attention. However, having known that person, that student for a while, I was able to say, well, actually, I'm surprised that you are surprised because we had talked about this before. So some things to think about is that what is happening between the student and the clinical educator? It looks to me like having a relatively new clinical educator, probably that individual didn't know how to handle the student's behavior and how to approach the student about it. What is the role of the clinical educator? I would say to talk to the student, but if the educator doesn't feel comfortable addressing this with the student, talking to the university liaison for strategy. In any event, the university liaison was helpful in that the student needed to confront the concerns about inappropriate nonverbal communication that had been brought up in the past and were now being shown in the new internship setting. Now, the supervisor, and this is the more seasoned clinical educator, said to me that when she has student clinicians, and again, this is a seasoned clinical educator, that she ensures that all students have a solid understanding of all the possible diagnoses that may be encountered in the work setting. So this is part of that orientation period. She says for every session, students discuss how they plan to provide feedback to the parents regarding the session. My goal is to have students feel comfortable in a safe environment when providing information to families, so that when they are on their own, they are comfortable and have a general idea of safe language to use for families. So what I see here is that the clinical educator has developed strategies to prevent communication problems from happening as much as possible. It's never possible to prevent any communication differences or problems. What I want you to do now is to take 5 minutes to think about what you need next. I'd like you to identify the strengths in the area of supervision that you already have and areas that you think need improvement or more education or more resources in the area of supervision. I also want you to think about what your goals might be to improve your competence. It might be doing an online video session, and I'm going to talk to you about resources in the next segment. It might be to get more information. It might be to talk to a university liaison, to talk about supervising one of their graduate students. So what I'd like you to do is just take another 5 minutes, and again, I will monitor the time for you, to spend, again, introspectively thinking about what you feel you need right now to be a competent clinical educator. So I'll be back with you at the 2.5 minute point. Hi, I'm checking in. 2.5 minutes to go. And 1 more minute. Okay. I hope that you were able to identify areas for growth for you. Let's look at resources for clinical education. ASHA has supervision courses that you can take that will provide continuing education and will probably reinforce things that we talked about today. So there are 2 sessions, 9 building blocks of supervision and knowledge, skills, and competencies for supervision. Now this webinar, this is actually a print of what the webinar has. Talks about feedback and reflection, self-assessment, competencies from 5 knowledge and skill areas. Will be provided with specific goals to improve knowledge, skills, and competencies. You'll be able to describe how critical reflection supports professional growth of the clinical educator as well as the supervisee. Develop self-directed goals to improve competencies in supervision. Now, I talked about the Council on Academic Programs in Communication Sciences and Disorders. That was the organization to which I belonged. And they have some fantastic e-learning courses that they have developed in the area of clinical education. Now, you can only access these through a university program, but they're free. So if you really want to dig deep and hear pioneers and strong speakers in the areas of clinical education and well-experienced individuals, I highly recommend these. The Foundations video talks about reflective activities, emphasis on the role of quality clinical instruction, and instructor-student relationships. Another video is effective student-clinician-educator relationships. Let's see, talking about the dynamics between clinical educators and their students in graduate programs, emphasis on fostering relationships, and the newest module that they put out, which is now out, is regarding feedback. So I think that any one of these, all three of these would be fantastic resources for you. And again, they're free, but you need to go through a university program to get the code. I want to talk a little bit about the references and highlight those from today's talk that I think will be of most importance for you to know. Obviously, ASHA is updating its information about telepractice weekly, it seems, and any questions that you have about the aspects of that are well addressed by ASHA. And again, ASHA does have videos and webinars regarding clinical education. I really like the Tipton book, Personal and Professional Growth for Healthcare Professionals. Now, this is more for students, I would say, in terms of reflecting on their growth. I think that would be a great resource if you have a student clinician or a CF who you think would benefit from that. Definitely the books put out by the Indiana group, so McCrae and Brasseur, on the supervisory process, top notch, and more than likely there are more current publications. ASHA also has more current publications since its development of the ad hoc committee on clinical education, so continue to look at that. I want to thank you for staying with me for this time. I hope that you found it learning filled and that it gave you food for thought in how you can further develop competence, skill, and clinical education. I hope that you continue to attend Michigan Speech Language Hearing Association meetings where the university programs will be continuing to provide information about clinical education, because it really is a mission of that team, that group, to make awareness of best practices in clinical education available to all members of MISHA. So it's with gratitude that I thank you for hanging in with me for this time, and I look forward to seeing you functioning as clinical educators in the future. Take care and be healthy.